What's up, heroes and Hylians? So, you think you know the Land of Termina? The mysterious setting of Majora's Mask is one of the most unique locations in all of the Zelda series. Or is it? What if I told you that we've actually visited this area in another game? And what if I also told you that it's not actually a parallel mirror dimension like you thought it was? Let's go back to the dawn of the first day to take a fresh look at the Land of Termina. And as always, spoilers ahead for the Legend of Zelda series. So let's just get straight to it. I think the Land of Termina is not a parallel dimension, but simply a neighboring country outside the borders of Hyrule, which has been altered by powerful eldritch magics, and also the future location of New Hyrule from Spirit Tracks. We'll get to why I think this in a moment, but first let's go over why I think Termina is not an alternate reality. So what all do we know about Termina? Well, first, Link comes to Termina after having already left Hyrule to find Navi. Princess Zelda explicitly says that Link is leaving Hyrule before he even starts on his journey. So even if Termina was part of a mirror dimension or alternate reality, it still wouldn't be in the right physical location within that alternate reality to be a parallel version of Hyrule like most people think it is. Second, we've actually already seen what a parallel world or mirror dimension of Hyrule looks like, in the form of Lorule from A Link Between Worlds. Lorule was made explicitly to be the mirror image parallel dimension alternate reality to Hyrule, so the fact that Termina isn't ever stated to be such casts serious doubt on the claim that Termina shares the same status as Lorule. It also would make a ton of sense to have two mirror dimension realities for Hyrule. After all, a mirror only creates one reflection, not two. Not to mention that Termina as a location is so drastically different from Hyrule but has characters who look identical, whereas Lorule as a location is extremely similar looking in its geography while having characters who look somewhat similar to their Hylian counterparts, but not identical. So all in all, there's a lot of holes in the theory that Termina is a mirror dimension of Hyrule. But then, why do people think that in the first place? Well, while traveling through an unknown forest outside of Hyrule, Link is ambushed by the Skull Kid wearing the dark and powerful Majora's Mask, and eventually ends up falling into a dark cavern of some sort, at which point strange symbols and images of various masks float across the screen. Afterward, Link finds himself in the mysterious Land of Termina, where the NPCs look identical to NPCs from Ocarina of Time's Hyrule, but have personalities and identities that are quite different. Most people interpret this transition as being some sort of magic portal or wormhole that warps Link to a parallel dimension. They also argue that it must be a mirror dimension to Hyrule because of the identical looking NPCs. Honestly, it's a good theory, and based on the evidence, it's not unreasonable to conclude that this is the explanation. But it's not the only explanation that fits the evidence, or even the one that fits the best. First, we're never actually explicitly told that the weird, warpy transition we go through before entering Termina is taking us to a different dimension. That's just an assumption that people have made. It's entirely possible that we just fell down a hole and some weird symbols floated by because video games. It's also possible that even if it is some kind of magic portal or wormhole, it's simply taking us to a different location within the same reality rather than warping us to a different reality altogether. Second, if it truly were a parallel reality, some of the differences between characters are a bit too different. Like, some are completely identical, but others are way too different. Like, Dampé in Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask is basically the exact same person in both games. Same personality, same looks, same job, same everything. But then other characters, like for example Kotake and Koome, have totally different personalities, jobs, skills, backstories, and everything else. Then you have characters like Romani, who is a farm girl that you get Epona from in both games, but in Termina she has a big sister and no parents, while her Ocarina of Time counterpart, Malon, has a father but no siblings. Additionally, if Termina truly is a parallel dimension that the Skull Kid warped Link into, how did the Happy Mask salesman get there? We know he isn't a lookalike because the Skull Kid steals Majora's Mask from him before he and Link ever arrive in Termina, and the salesman then follows them to Termina to get the mask back, meaning this is the same mask salesman that we see in Ocarina of Time, not an alternate reality doppelganger. So the fact that this non-magical salesman was able to travel to Termina without the use of a reality-warping eldritch artifact like Majora's Mask would seem to indicate that it's somewhere you can go through mundane means, just a different location within the same reality as Hyrule, and not a different dimension that you need to warp to with magic. We also know that Majora's Mask itself originated from Termina, as it was used by an ancient tribe native to the land in some sort of dark rituals. Not to mention, we know the Skull Kid was able to visit Termina before he ever had the mask. We're shown in a cutscene that Skull Kid met the fairies, Tattle and Tail, in Termina before he had the mask. And then later he steals the mask from the salesman after having met the fairies. This proves irrefutably that it is possible to travel back and forth between Termina and Hyrule without magic. Hylians. Oh, not to mention that the people living in Termina are clearly Hylians and not humans. For those unaware, Hylians and humans are actually two distinct separate races in Zelda. Easily distinguishable by their ears, Hylians have long pointed ears and humans have smaller rounded ears like real life humans do. For instance, the people of Orden Village and Twilight Princess are pretty much all humans, except for Link, who is of course Hylian. Take a look at everyone's ears next time you're playing Twilight Princess. Anyway, Hylians, as the name implies, come from Hyrule. So if Termina was some sort of parallel reality that you need a magic wormhole to get to, how did all the Hylians who live in Termina wind up there? Okay, so if Termina isn't a parallel mirror dimension, what is it? How do I explain the identical looking NPCs? Well, I think it's all due to Skull Kid and the power of Majora's Mask itself. See, the Skull Kid is simple, childlike, naive. He clearly has intelligence and isn't like a mindless animal or anything, but he's not quite as smart as the Hylians, Zoras, or Gorons. We see this quite clearly in our interactions with Skull Kid during Ocarina of Time. And childlike beings like this tend to have a very simplistic view of the world, a view that often isn't very accurate. He may seem really intelligent during our interactions with him throughout Majora's Mask, but that's the mask talking, not Skull Kid. I think that in Skull Kid's case, his simplistic mind looked at all the characters he saw and knew in Ocarina of Time and said, this person is a soldier and looks like this, so this must be what all soldiers look like. This person is a farm girl and looks like that, so that must be what all farm girls look like. That person is a witch and looks like this, so that must be what all witches look like. And so on. Now obviously this viewpoint is incorrect, but for a simple creature like Skull Kid, it's exactly the kind of conclusion he would come to. Those characters are all he ever knew, so he never had any reason to think otherwise. And think of all the dumb stuff we all believed as kids. Anyone else just assume that cats were girls and dogs were boys? Or think that regular milk came from white cows and chocolate milk came from brown cows? Who here thought that teachers all lived at school and slept in the classroom? See what I mean? Childlike minds come up with some interesting ideas. I think that Skull Kid's mind came up with this idea that all soldiers look like the soldiers he knew, and all witches look like the witches he knew, and so on. So when he went to Termina and saw soldiers that clearly were soldiers, and witches who clearly were witches, but they didn't look like the ones he was used to, his mind couldn't really comprehend that. So to compensate, his mind sort of altered his perception. When he looked at the farm girl, his mind showed him the farm girl he knew, even though the one standing in front of him actually looked different. When he looked at the witch, his mind showed him one of the witches he was familiar with, even though the witch he was looking at didn't look like that at all. Then, without him even realizing it, the power of the mask amplified this perception and sort of overlaid it on top of the real world. It literally projected his perception of reality onto reality itself, making people's appearances match what he was expecting them to look like, but not altering their personalities. And we already know that Skull Kid is capable of drastically altering people's appearances with the power of the mask. Just look at Keifi, a grown man that Skull Kid made to look like a child. So then, if it's not a parallel dimension, what exactly is Termina? Well, I think it's a foreign country, somewhere outside of Hyrule, that had the appearances of its citizens altered by the power of the mask. This is also supported by the official Zelda Encyclopedia, which states that the combination of the Skull Kid's burdened heart and the evil magic within Majora's Mask transforms the world into Land of Termina. Transforms it into Termina. That's pretty clear, isn't it? Termina looks the way it does because of Skull Kid and the mask. Also note that it doesn't say that they were transported to Termina. It says that Termina was an existing place that was altered. It's right there in black and white, folks. Okay, but what was that about it also being the location of New Hyrule during Spirit Tracks? Well, after the events of Wind Waker, Link and Tetra sail off to find a landmass large enough to start a new kingdom on. After a brief detour with the Ghost Ship during Phantom Hourglass, they do eventually find a sufficient landmass and establish the kingdom of New Hyrule. Hundreds of years later, the events of Spirit Tracks happen. And if you look at the map of Termina and the map of New Hyrule from Spirit Tracks, well, it's kind of a dead ringer. We have frozen mountains to the northwest, hot, arid, rocky terrain to the northeast, grassland to the southwest, and to the southeast, well, in Majora's Mask we have swamp, but in Spirit Tracks we have ocean, which is exactly what that swampy terrain would become if the world were hit with, say, a massive flood. The flood waters would wash out the swamps and leave behind more open waters. And the cherry on top, both have a location with a tower right in the middle that acts as a central hub. The similarities are just far too great to be coincidence. What I believe happened was that when the world flooded, most of Termina was at a high enough elevation that it stayed above the water. But the land and soil parts of the swamp were never very solid or stable since, you know, it's a swamp, and so it all got washed away, leaving behind the ocean area we see in Spirit Tracks. The Deku Scrubs who called the swamps home were wiped out in the process. The Gorons relocated from the frozen peaks in the northwest to the hot areas in the northeast. The Zora, who previously lived in the waters of the Great Bay, could not survive after the Great Flood drastically altered the quality of the waters they called home. and they died out. If you recall, the Zora of Old Hyrule had to evolve into the Rito to survive after the Great Flood for the same reason. The water changed so much they couldn't live in it anymore. Either way, New Hyrule was established on the land that was formerly Termina, and at some point between then and the beginning of Spirit Tracks, Demon King Malladus showed up, was defeated, and locked away inside the earth with the Spirit Train tracks acting as shackles. And the Locomo Tower was built to act as a lock, built quite possibly on the remains of the clock tower from Majora's Mask. I mean, there was already a big important tower right there smack dab in the middle of the map. Why mess with what works? So yeah, Termina is/was a country outside of Hyrule, but definitely still in the same dimension. Its inhabitants had their appearances altered by the power of the mask. Its geography and population were shifted by the Great Flood, and then Link and Tetra landed there and founded New Hyrule after the events of Wind Waker and Phantom Hourglass. No interdimensional portals, no parallel realities, no mirror dimensions, no magic wormholes, just a foreign country that just couldn't catch a break from Hyrule Kingdom's shenanigans. Hey, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, you should check out my other Zelda videos decoding the true timeline, or maybe my video on why Rick Sanchez is a horrible inventor. Please be sure to subscribe and smash the bell and leave comments and all the YouTube things that the algorithm wants me to say. This has been So You Think You Know, and now you do know.